that I am in a different location. About, 6 or 8 weeks ago, I started posting videos about number knitting and why it was taking so long, and then I talked about, finally introduced myself to you all as having a podcast, and then I did episode 1, and then I went MIA. And the reason for that is because we were moving. And so one of the reasons that we were moving is because we have big plans for our content creation, and we frankly needed more space. My husband also has a YouTube channel, and then I have this fledgling YouTube channel in addition to my regular publishing business, and we were running out of space. So we moved to a house like 5 minutes down the road. But regardless of how far away the house is or how close it is, to pack everything up is a tremendous amount of work. It was a lot easier 10 years ago when we moved into our current house. So we've been living there for 10 years, building a business and collecting belongings, and then we had to move it. And so that's why I went missing for a few weeks. It was not for a lack of wanting to podcast. I think about number knitting every day, throughout the day. I have so many ideas. I think I tried, recording like 3 or 4 different times, and then I got partway through and I was like, well, that's garbage. I can't put that out. So today I had a few minutes of a break mentally, where I had like all the urgent things in my life done that I needed to do, and I had about 5 or 10 minutes to actually just think about number knitting and where I was at, and kind of like pick up on the spot where I last left off, which I think in the Let's Talk About Squares baby video, I was going to talk about the rules of number knitting. And for those of you who are of a certain age, I should have had a theme song in there about Let's Talk About Squares, hoping that somebody would get the joke. Nobody got the joke. Let's talk about squares, baby. Anyway, if you went to high school in the 90s, you'll get it. The original song lyrics was not talking about squares. Anyhow, so I apologize if this sounds boomy. I have put down an area rug, and this is my handy dandy tripod holder for now, because our studio is empty. Let me take you on a tour real quick. We have a bookcase, an empty closet, a storage rack with drawers. My husband even got some of those fancy dancy roll down background things that we could put lights on. And it's just like a big empty room. Ooh. So this is what I'm gonna be transforming into number knitting headquarters. Also, mascot. This is Sally. Okay. Hopefully that didn't make you dizzy. So I last left off on the rules of number knitting. I was kind of flipping through the book, talking about like how it was arranged, like the history of it, the introduction to number knitting. In one of my other videos, I actually read through the whole introduction. I'm sorry if that was a little tedious. I'm not a voice actor, so I did my best. But I wanted you all to have kind of like a foundational understanding of the organization of the book for those of you that don't have a copy, which I'm guessing is probably most of you, because as you may know, the copies on Amazon are like $750, which is why very few people have one. That's also why I made the digital version available for 1/10 of the price, so that more people can have access to it. So in the original book, she had talked about the rules for number knitting, and I thought I had a pretty good understanding of what the rules are. It's on page 22. So she talks about how to number net, and in there she lists some rules. She lists 4 specific rules. And then she talks about how to knit the units. And she goes through explaining how to knit each of the 7 units. And with instructions on each of those, there is, so here's how to knit the square. And she also explained how it is related to any of the other 7 shapes. And then for each of the 7 shapes, she provides a pattern where you can actually use that shape to make a project. Incidentally, I made that scarf. And I was a little puzzled how to wear it. I tried it like in the book. I gave it away during my discouraged period, so I don't have it to show you. I'll have to make another one. Like here, how to make the rectangle. And you can see in these instructions, she references the rules. See at the bottom of this one, it says see rule 4. And those rules are the ones that are on page 23. See those rules there? So she starts with just 4 rules. And those are like the basics of the things that you need to know when you are number knitting, you're just getting started number knitting. Now I thought that this was going to be, I thought I would find those rules in the patent application. And I encourage you to download the patent application and read through it. But the patent application is more about what is number knitting, how it has cross-braid tension, and how the units are picked up one from another. And the patent application describes what it is about that knitting that makes it patentable. Whereas the rules here describe things that, very practical things that you as a knitter need to know for how to number knit. And so she starts with just 4 rules. And to make it a little bit easier to understand, I highlighted them. These are the 4 rules. So the first rule is the box must be numbered. And when she is talking about that rule specifically applies to this little box right here. That box represents the number of stitches that each square on the graph paper represents. And so you could count how many squares wide by how many squares tall, and you can times it by this number here, and that will tell you how many stitches to cast on, or how tall or wide or whatever to work your units. And that particular design was on the bias, but it is a little bit easier to understand when it's here's one that's not on the bias. Like here, the box number is 3, and for unit 1, you would count however many down by however many wide, times it by 3, and that's the number of stitches for your unit. So that is rule 1, the box must be numbered. Rule number 2 is cast on and off with extreme looseness. And that's really important because one of the defining features of number knitting is that, generally speaking, it uses a really loose gauge for a lot looser than what most modern knitters are accustomed to. So I just knit a shawl a while back. It was called the Whirlpool Design Stole, and I think it was like 2.5 stitches to the edge on fingering weight yarn on size 10.5 or 11 needles. So like if you were knitting fingering weight, you'd probably use like size 4s or size 5, but this was size 10.5 for 2.5 stitches to the inch. And so because the fabric is very, it's very loose, it's important that the cast on and bind off edges have that same degree of elasticity. And when you do just a standard, like, you know, one stitch over the other bind off, it tends to get pretty tight. And so I'm sure she knew that. That's why she said to do it very loosely. Rule 3, slip the first stitch and purl the last stitch of every row. That will give you the chain stitch edge. Rule 4, all decreases or increases are made regularly and in the same position every other row to get the diagonal line. Because this is garter stitch, if you do a decrease or an increase every other row by 1 stitch, it's going to give you a really nice 45-degree angle. And so all of her designs, her being Valiant, all of her designs are based on those 45 and 90-degree angles. Okay, so that's where she started with the 4 rules of never knitting. And then she has you go through the different, the 7 shapes. You make a project for each of the 7 shapes. Like here's another one, the divided square rain hood. So you do your 7 shapes. Okay, so next in the book, she has another section called Rules, Symbols, and Abbreviations. Now, I tried recording this video like a month ago, and I got stuck because there's 2 different sets of rules, I thought. And so when I finally had the mental wherewithal to look at this more closely today, I compared the 2 pages side by side, and I highlighted the ones that were the same. And so if you look here, there's rule 1, 2, 3, and 4 are the same. In this second list of rules, there's 4 additional rules added, which are more of kind of like advanced number knitting techniques, things that that aren't just the basics, but things that would come a little bit later. And now that I read it, 2 of the 4 rules actually have to do with handling multiple units. And so when in the earlier section where she was talking about rules, there's only 1 unit per project, and so she wouldn't have really needed to even worry about how working with multiple units, because, you know, as correspondence students, you weren't there yet. But actually 3 of the 4 deal with multiple units. 4 of the 4 deal with multiple units. So rule number 5, a diagonal edge may not be picked up and knitted from or joined to a straight edge, but must always be joined to another diagonal edge. Now, if you were only working on a single unit project, that's it. You wouldn't have had to pick up anything. So that's why this second, this rule number 5 falls into like the second list of rules. But what's interesting about that is that in all of her designs, she has what she calls the flat edges, which is like the cast on and bind off edges. And then she also has the rising edges, which are like on the selvage. And so they can either be straight up and down, like for a rectangle or a square, or they could be on a bias, like for a single wing or a double wing. So you got those, or a triangle. That would also have a diagonal edge. And the reason she says a diagonal edge may not be picked up and knitted from or joined to a straight edge, caveat here, but must always be joined to another diagonal edge. Now that's because the ratio, if you have a right triangle, it's a 90-degree angle here. The long diagonal edge of the triangle is going to be a different length than the other two sides of the triangle, and so the ratio is going to be different. This diagonal edge here is going to be 1.4, where if these are 1, this would be 1.4. And so later on in the book, she says, you can't pick up from a diagonal edge unless a pucker is wanted. But she doesn't actually mention that pucker here. Okay, rule 6. Rule 5 talks about how to join two units together, how you do it when you're on the left side versus how you do it when you're on the right side of the current unit. Again, you wouldn't need that in projects that only have one unit. Rule 7, units of charts are to be numbered. Again, this is important because if you've got more than one unit that you're working on, then the units need to be numbered. Here's an example. This is called a twist scarf. You've got unit 1 and unit 2, and it tells you the order in which to knit them. Rule 8, tie contrasting yarn or key tag on first unit to indicate right side of work. Nowadays, people would probably use a stitch marker or a progress keeper when I am missing either one of those items because I've either dropped them in between the car seats or I don't have all my tools with me. I will do what she does and just tie a piece of contrasting yarn around, and that works just fine as well. I do think it's humbling that I've been working on this project for 7 years, and I just now looked at this section closely enough to realize, first of all, why there was 2 sets of rules, and secondly, how the first 4 rules are different than the last 4 rules. So, had I not attempted to educate my fellow knitters on this, I never would have done this. I just would have glossed over it. So thanks. It's interesting as I knit through these projects, the test knitters are bringing up little subtle things about the charts and the instructions that I have never really paid attention to, because I just look at the chart, get the gauge, look at the chart, and I knit it, and I don't honestly worry myself too much about what the instructions say. I just, I probably should a little bit more closely, but I don't. So my test knitters are really, they're pointing things out for me, and that's really helpful. So thanks for that. Those are the 8 rules of number knitting. Thanks, guys. Bye.